Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Yes, it's Planet America time. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, migrant caravans, terror and the midterms.
We are going to win, 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 and we are going to keep on winning like never before.
Also this week, as the polls tighten, I'll take a look at who's likely to vote and for whom.
Meanwhile, President Trump is tearing up another treaty. This time, it is a Cold War nuclear missile agreement.
We have to look at Russia and China in a way that we didn't have to, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
But first, it's John tearing through the news.
The FBI is leading the search after a series of pipe bombs packed with shards of glass were sent to prominent figures including the Clintons, former President Barack Obama, former Attorney General Eric Holder and billionaire businessman George Soros. CNN was reporting on the bombs in other locations when another explosive device was identified in their building in New York. It was addressed to former CIA Director John Brennan, care of Time Warner and CNN, despite currently being an MSNBC contributor.
We're going to jump in. There's a fire alarm here.
You might have heard it in the background. We're going to find out what the latest is
we'll be right back.
At CNN. We're going to be right back.
All the packages had similar labels and a return address of Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. The one thing linking all of the bombers' intended targets, including Congresswoman Maxine Waters, former Vice President Joe Biden and actor Robert De Niro, they are all critics of President Trump. Mr. Trump said that he would spare no expense in bringing the perpetrator of what he called a despicable act to justice, and he called on Americans to come together.
And I just want to tell you that in these times, we have to unify. We have to come together and send one very clear, strong, unmistakable message that acts or threats of political violence of any kind have no place in the United States of America.
But that message of unity clearly didn't get through to Trump supporters at a rally in Wisconsin just a few hours later, where a familiar chant started up. And speaking later at that rally, President Trump blamed unnamed politicians, protesters and the media for the divisions in America.
The media also has a responsibility to set a civil tone and to stop the endless hostility and constant negative and oftentimes false attacks and stories. Have to do it.
Two things. Firstly, between January 1969 and October 1970, there were 370 actual bombings in New York City alone, albeit many of them were very minor. This was when the president was Richard Nixon, who was just as anti-media as Trump is today. But America survived that period, and I'm sure they'll survive this one as well. Secondly, we don't know who did this. We don't know why they did this. We don't know if they were inspired by Trump or fake news or their talking dog. And we especially don't know if there's a 0% chance that these suspicious packages were sent out by conservatives, like many conservative activists were suggesting on Twitter yesterday. This activist went on, caravans, fake bomb threats. These leftists are going all out for the midterms. These false flag conspiracies are not helping.
Neither of those talking dogs. I'm worried about them. Meanwhile, immigration has emerged as a major issue ahead of November's midterm elections, as this migrant caravan of up to 7,000 people continues to make its way from Honduras through Guatemala up into Mexico, heading towards the United States. US Defence Secretary Jim Mattis sending 800 troops down to the border now, we hear, although federal troops aren't legally allowed to intercept immigrants. It's a state issue. President Trump sent a series of tweets on the subject this week, mostly blaming Democrats for not passing tougher immigration laws, and then this one claiming the migrant caravan contained criminals and Middle Easterners.
Sadly, it looks like Mexico's police and military are unable to stop the caravan heading to the southern border of the United States. Criminals and unknown Middle Easterners are mixed in. I've already alerted Border Patrol and military that this is a national emergency. Must change laws.
Definitely an emergency, Chaz. Middle Easterners, though, in a migrant group from Honduras? Really? Who says? The CIA experts on the ground? How about some guy on Fox and Friends?
But you got the president of Guatemala saying to a local newspaper down there just last week, they caught over 100 ISIS fighters in Guatemala trying to could have used this caravan or other processes. He talked to their local newspaper. We don't know. It hasn't been verified. But even one poison pill is too many in a caravan like that.
You'll be astonished to learn that isn't 100% right. It turns out that isn't what the president of Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, said. According to the fact checkers at the New York Times, President Morales did say Guatemala has arrested almost 100 people highly linked to terrorist groups, specifically ISIS, and that they have been deported to their country of origin. That happening since he took office in 2016. He was not claiming they had infiltrated any migration group. Still, the stories were often running on right-wing websites like Judicial Watch, The Blaze and LifeZette. And that feedback loop was completed on Fox News by former Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich.
You were a terrorist and wanted to get in the U.S., and you saw 10,000 people trying to get in the U.S., how unlikely is it that you might decide to join them?
But while this may be a political winner for President Trump, thanks to the support of loyal foot soldiers like Lou Dobbs on Fox Business, but you also get the feeling that old Lou will be glad when it's over, Chaz.
The caravan of mostly Central American immigrants is now in the Mexican city of Oaxaca tonight.
Sorry, what was that again?
Oaxaca.
Okay, apparently it's weeks late. But then again, as the man says...
This is a country where we speak English, not Spanish.
He's right. Lou doesn't talk Spanish.
Look, when Lou Dobbs does take his vacation, he should take Fox reporter Griff Jenkins with him. That guy has got cabin fever. He literally hid in the bushes to single-handedly stop the illegals himself.
We've been hiding in the bushes waiting to witness one of these crossings. Let's go. They're coming right now. You can see they've come in. They've got a family in a raft.
Excuse me, sir. Were you trying to cross into America illegally? We've seemed to have foiled this attempt, but officials tell us that he's probably just going to look for another spot.
Who needs a border patrol?
Who needs a wall?
That's right, Griff's on the case. We can rest easy. Look, this caravan comes at a demanding time for the administration because illegal immigration is on the way up. These are 4 years worth of interceptions on the southern border during Obama's second term. And you can see last year, interceptions went right down. But then this year, they were back up again, right up with Obama's worst result. Mind you, illegal immigration is still a lot less than it used to be. It's not like there's a crisis. That's this year's increase at the end of the graph. There. But the increase still adds pressure on Trump because it isn't immediately clear how he can stop it. Sarah Sanders said the caravan wouldn't be happening if Democrats joined Republicans to build the wall. But these people are seeking asylum. They're allowed to do that. No wall is going to stop that happening. Okay, so what if you do something awful to them when they come? Like, say, separate them from their families? Well, they tried that, remember? And it led to a roughly 5% uptick in the number of people caught crossing the border illegally. They pushed the zero tolerance thing as far as it could go, to the point of sending 2-year-olds to immigration court, like that girl there. And yet, after all that controversy, with 66 kids still separated from their families 5 months later, more than half the people caught by Border Patrol agents in September are families or children travelling alone. So, expose all those kids and families to the Flores Agreement, which, remember, forces you to process kids within 20 days of them arriving, and the system starts to break down. Hundreds of migrant families are currently being released from detention without warning, without instructions. The government just needs to get rid of them. That is the context in which 7,000 more migrants are about to arrive. And while it's true that more people than ever believe that immigration is a good thing, that is legal immigration. And according to conservative-leaning pollster Rasmussen, 51% of people want every one of these caravan migrants stopped, and only 38% want individual cases reviewed. So, what was Trump's reaction? He tweeted about punishing Central America by cutting off their foreign aid. But it's hard to see how that helps. These countries have poverty rates of 40%. 60% and 60%. And they are the number 1, number 2, and number 15 countries in the world for homicide. I don't think cutting foreign aid is going to make people less likely to leave them, especially given if we look at budgeted American foreign aid for these countries, it's in the ballpark of $50 million each. But the remittances sent back to these countries from immigrants, mostly in America, is $8 billion, $4 billion, and $5 billion. That's like 20% of GDP for some of these countries. I suspect they're going to keep coming. But who knows for sure? All we know is there is another caravan coming right behind this one. So the pressure is only going to ratchet up.
Yeah, indeed. Well, all of this, of course, is happening just days out from the congressional midterm elections, Wednesday week, our time. And here's how the president is seeking to define that contest.
At stake in this election is whether we continue the extraordinary prosperity we have achieved, or whether we let the radical Democratic mob take a giant wrecking ball to our country and our economy. Hashtag jobs, not mobs.
And that message may be working. Republican hopes of keeping control of the Senate and even extending their majority there have increased this week as individual races and the generic congressional polls continue to tighten. YouGov this week gave Democrats a 6-point lead, while a Rasmussen poll, which, as Chaz says, tends to be pro-Republican, gave the Democrats just a 3-point lead, averaged out over 3 weeks. And the Democrats are up 8 points, just enough to take back the House, but not much more. To the battleground states, and polls are showing Republican Kevin Cramer building his buffer over incumbent Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, a 16-point lead in an NBC Valley News poll, and more than 10 points up in the poll average now. Another Democrat in danger, Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana, is 4 points behind Republican Mike Braun in a poll from Mason Strategies, which is also a Republican polling firm. Lucy Brenton, the Libertarian, there polling just 3 points. Some of her support seems to be drifting to the Republican Braun. The race remains a statistical tie, though, with Donnelly less than 1 point ahead in the average of polls. That in a state Donald Trump carried by almost 19 points in 2016. A Siena poll has put Republican Martha McSally 2 points in front of Democrat Kirsten Sinema in the race to succeed Arizona Republican Senator Jeff Flake. There is a 4-point margin of error there, so we can still call that a toss-up, with McSally just in front in the average of polls. Meanwhile, in neighbouring Nevada, Republican Dean Heller is looking a lot more likely to hold on to his Senate seat, that in a state that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. Heller has a 6-point lead over Democrat Jackie Rose, and that according to an Ipsos poll. It is still anyone's guess in the Florida Senate race, though, between incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson and outgoing Republican Governor Rick Scott, who wants to go to Washington. 2 polls this week had Scott leading by 1, those from St. Pete and Florida Atlantic, while Gravis has given Nelson a 4-point lead. And finally, in Texas, Ted Cruz is now looking a lot more comfortable against Beto O'Rourke, who was seeking to become the first Democrat to win statewide office in the States in a quarter of a century. Senator Cruz 7 points ahead, and he even got a new nickname this week, Chaz, from President Trump. He's not Lion Ted anymore.
Beautiful Ted. Beautiful Texas. I call him Texas Ted.
Beautiful Ted. Texas Ted. It's not Lying Ted anymore. What do you reckon? Catchy enough for you?
Yeah, I prefer not to catch whatever Ted Cruz has, to be honest. Anyway, time now for part 3 of my never-ending midterms preview. Midterms are usually quite tough on the president's party. As you can see, they usually lose seats. The average swing against the president's party is 7.3 points, which sounds a lot like this year so far. The median seats lost in the post-war period is 22, which is interesting because the target for Democrats this year is 23 seats. So history says this will be tight. Midterms have been so favourable to the opposition that in the last 35 years, only 4 opposition senators have lost re-election. Mind you, during that period, opposition senators never ran for re-election in states that voted for the president by over 30 points, like Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin are currently trying to do. History also says a popular president can help. A big net approval rating on the right there can reduce the swing against your party. In this case, according to 538, Trump has a net approval of -9 points, which means history says the Republicans should suffer something like a 9 to 10 point swing, which sounds a little bit high to me. Finally, history says that when Republicans are defending 25 seats that Hillary Clinton won, but Democrats are only defending 13 seats that Trump won, there's a real advantage for the Democrats. But all of this pales in comparison to the biggest factor of all, the share of registered voters who actually turn out to vote. Take the last midterms. More than 100 million registered voters didn't bother to vote in 2014, leading to a voter turnout rate of 36%, the lowest turnout rate since World War II. But the Republican support base did turn out, so the Republicans won. And that cost the Democrats Merrick Garland and the Supreme Court. And that all has relevance today, because out of those who did vote in 2014, Republicans currently have a 6-point lead, according to the New York Times. But amongst those who didn't vote in 2014, Democrats currently have a 10-point lead. So how many new voters will there be? It could make all the difference. And what groups will those new voters come from? Because some groups turn out more than others. Let's go to the wall.
Big, beautiful wall.
Okay, let's look at some key groups. First of all, women. In the 69 most competitive districts, women currently favour Democrats by 13 points, but the men only favour Republicans by 5 points. Remember, they're the districts that are going to win or lose the House. The polling is even more lopsided for college-educated women. You can see a small Democratic-leaning gap opening up for college-educated men here, but for college-educated women, there's a gulf of like 35 points. And as for college-educated white women, well, at one point in time this year, they favoured Democrats by almost 50 points. In the battleground districts today, college-educated white women are favouring Democrats by about 30 points. This does cut both ways though. You see, the white non-college educated voters are a key Republican group. They've had a consistent 20 to 25 point Republican leaning ever since Trump showed up. And in the battleground districts, the white working class currently favour Republicans by double digits. Unfortunately though for Republicans, women for the past decade or so of midterms have turned out to vote a bit more than men have. And college graduates have turned out to vote more than non-college graduates as well. Postgraduate degree holders are even more Democratic and they turn out to vote even more again. So the Democrats have a big advantage here. Next group, not so much. Hispanics are not nearly as reliably Democratic as many assume. While Trump attracts somewhere between 10 and 15% approval from black people, there are polls where Trump received as much as 35% of Latino approval, or even 41%. And the turnout of Hispanics in midterms has been woeful, about 27% last midterms, and well below blacks and whites for decades. So I would not be relying on that vote to get me over the top. But this leads us to the biggest wild card of all. Millennials. There's about 62 million of those people registered to vote, so they should theoretically dominate. And given the polling of millennials, especially for millennial women, they should dominate for Democrats. But they don't. Because if 2018 voters were to turn out like 2014 voters, the 18 to 29s who make up 21% of the voting population would only make up 10% of the votes. And the over 60s who make up 28% of the voting age population would make up almost 40% of the votes. Does that seem right to you? maybe it seems right to him, but that wasn't a one-off. Young people have not been voting for a very long time, and that undervoting extends all the way up to 44-year-olds. In fact, if you averaged out the turnout figures from 1982 to 2010, there have been less voters who are 18 to 24 years old than 76 to 84 years old. And 29% of the total vote has come just from the people who are aged 56 to 60. That's only 5 years. Needless to say, this here is a key group for Republicans. Note, by the way, this was even the case in the early 80s. Even when the geezers are doing all the voting now were young, back then, they only had 26% turnout as well. So it is not a young people today thing. Although today's college students have come up with the worst possible reason to not vote. They can't vote absentee apparently because they don't know where to buy stamps. Look, the main reason why they don't vote is probably not because they don't care. It's because they don't know much about politics. The older you are, the more likely you are to know about your candidates and therefore vote. But where does all this leave us for this election? Could one of the parties get their key groups to turn out more? It is hard to know. There are millions of different contradictory polls out there. For example, according to a Wall Street Journal NBC poll last week, those with a high interest in the 2018 election are a lot more of them than there were interested in the 2014 election. In fact, women, look at them, they're more enthusiastic than men. Blacks are more enthusiastic than whites, and Hispanics are going off the charts for some reason. The 18 to 34s have caught up a heap with the over 65s. This to me looks like a Democratic rout. But last month, when Gallup asked, are you absolutely certain to vote? They got very different results. Women, yes, had slightly higher numbers than men, again, as always. But then, only 26% projected turnout from 18 to 29s, and 82% from over 65s, and only 27% projected turnout from Hispanics. Now, this was all before the peak of Kavanaugh, so maybe there's going to be a tidal wave of enthusiasm now. We don't know. But what we do know is that the real numbers, whatever they may be, will determine the election. So we'll be finding out soon enough.
Big, beautiful world.
For the most part, I'm an easygoing guy, but not when Mike Braun keeps lying about my record. I split with my own party to support funding for Trump's border wall. The liberal left wants to chop defense spending.
President Selina Meyer thinks she can chop our prosperity, our dignity, and our stature around the world. Well, someone is chopping back.
I'm about giving our troops the edge. He ships jobs to China. We've got to cut that out. I'm Joe Donnelly. I approve this message.
I'm Jonah Ryan.
Vote for Jonah Ryan. He'll chop President Meyer down to size.
My name is Jonah Ryan, and I approve this message.
This week, President Trump announced he was tearing up the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, and he threatened a new arms race into the bargain.
This should have been done years ago. Until people come to their senses, we have more money than anybody else by far. We'll build it up until they come to their senses. When they do, then we'll all be smart and we'll all stop. And by the way, not only stop, we'll reduce, which I would love to do.
But far from simply abandoning Ronald Reagan's signature Cold War agreement with the Soviet Union, President Trump may in fact be seeking to emulate the Gipper. In the early 1980s, the Cold War was on such a hair trigger, even a presidential joke was enough to provoke a red alert.
The president was joking his way through an audio check on August 11th.
I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
A coded message left Soviet military headquarters in Vladivostok. It said, in part, "We now embark on military action against the U.S. forces."
But Ronald Reagan certainly wasn't joking when he described the Soviet Union as
an evil empire.
President Reagan advocated a policy of peace through strength and presided over the largest peacetime increase in military spending.
If we continue our past pattern of only rebuilding our defenses in fits and starts, we will never convince the Soviets that it's in their interest to behave with restraint and negotiate genuine arms reductions.
Part of that money went towards the Strategic Defense Initiative, immediately nicknamed Star Wars.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Nice idea, except some feared anti-missile weapons technology like lasers threatened to overturn the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction.
The president is proposing what nuclear planners have rejected for years. The anti-ballistic missile, or ABM, was scrapped by Washington in the 1970s precisely because it might work.
Hang on, what? Why?
Because if either side felt safe from attack, that made nuclear war more acceptable and therefore more probable.
Oh, okay. But then, as US military spending surged in the mid-1980s, creating an arms race with the Soviets, President Reagan held out an olive branch. What if defensive weapons like Star Wars could make nuclear weapons redundant, thus making the world a safer place for everyone?
My proposal is that we make it available to all the world. We don't just keep it for our own advantage.
3 Soviet leaders died in Reagan's first term without him having met any one of them. In 1985, that changed when Reagan sat down in Geneva with the new General Secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Are you getting along?
See that, can't you?
At that summit, Gorbachev made an extraordinary offer. He would be willing to reduce all nuclear forces to 0 if the US would give up its militarization of space through Star Wars. 2 months later, Gorbachev set a target date, the year 2000. More summits followed. The pair agreed to reduce the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then, in late 1987, came the INF Treaty, banning all intermediate-range missiles.
For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction. In this case, the complete elimination of an entire class of US and Soviet nuclear missiles.
But the ultimate aim of complete denuclearization was a bridge too far. For Reagan, Star Wars was the only way to eliminate nuclear weapons. For Gorbachev, the only way to eliminate nuclear weapons was to keep weapons out of space. The arms race added to the Soviet Union's economic woes and final collapse. As it happened, Star Wars never really got off the ground, and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 made the whole idea seem redundant, until recently.
Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
President Trump's new Space Force may ultimately see the kinds of space-based weapons Reagan imagined 35 years ago become a reality. And his decision this week to abandon the 1987 INF Treaty and embark on a new arms race may well have in mind a similar economic effect on post-Soviet Russia and even China.
Yeah, one of the things that was a little odd about America withdrawing from that treaty, John, is that that treaty prohibited ground-based missiles of intermediate range, but America doesn't really do that kind of thing. In fact, Washington destroyed 846 missiles under the treaty, compared to Russia destroying 1,846 missiles. So why end the treaty? Well, China is not part of this treaty. And according to the Pacific Commander last year, China has more than 2,000 of these ground-based missiles that Russia and America weren't allowed to have. So that does add some context to the decision. I think people would be less worried about the end of this treaty if we didn't simultaneously hear that John Bolton had also been blocking talks on extending a different treaty, the New START Treaty, which restricts intercontinental ballistic missiles, especially since in 2010, John Bolton described that treaty as unilateral disarmament. That is exactly the kind of hyper-aggressive talk that people feared from John Bolton when he was appointed. And I think it might be making the defence community a little bit nervous.
Yes, well, let's find out just how tetchy they are. Stephen Pfeiffer is a 25-year US State Department veteran where his focus was on US-Russia relations and specifically arms control. He also served as the Clinton administration's ambassador to Ukraine. And he joins us now from Stanford, California. Ambassador Pfeiffer, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
In walking away from the INF Treaty this week and flagging potentially a new arms race, what do you think President Trump is trying to achieve?
Well, I think on one hand you see the president who does not like to see the United States bound by international agreements. He's also unhappy that Russia has violated the treaty, which the Russians have. And while I would argue you can't stay in a treaty forever if the other side is violating the treaty, now was not the time. It was an unwise decision to withdraw from the treaty now.
What were the violations the Russians have been guilty of, and to what extent are the Americans also guilty of violating this treaty?
The treaty bans all American and Russian ground-launched missiles with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. And the Russians, unfortunately, have developed and deployed a ground-launched cruise missile in that range band. So that's a violation of the major provision of the treaty. Now, the Russians deny that they have violated the treaty. They instead insist that there have been 3 American violations. 2 of the Russian charges, I believe, are bogus, but there is one that I think has a bit merit. They're concerned that the missile launcher for missile interceptors in Romania could also hold a prohibited offensive missile. And it's a technical issue, but I think it's one that the United States perhaps could address, and actually could address the Russian concern, I believe, fairly easily. In the ideal world, you'd see the two sides come together, the United States being prepared to talk about the missile installation in Romania and how to address the Russian concern, and Russia prepared to talk about its ground-launched cruise missile, which violates the treaty. Unfortunately, that has not happened.
Ambassador, isn't there some kind of dispute resolution process within the treaty itself to assist in these kinds of matters?
There is. The treaty actually provides for a special verification commission, and one of its assigned tasks is to meet to resolve any questions of compliance with the treaty. That group has met, I believe, twice in the last couple of years, but no reported progress. I guess at one point in December of last year they met, and the American side said, well, at least now the Russians have conceded that the missile in question on the Russian side, which the Russians call the 9M729, that the missile exists, but the Russians deny that it is a missile of intermediate range.
Was this a treaty that was always designed to be limited to the US and the Soviet Union or Russia? Because critics say that it was really out of date because it didn't involve the rest of the world.
Right. Well, this was a treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then after the Soviet Union broke up, several of the succeeding states, including Russia, took on the obligations. Now, there wasn't a time in about 2006, 2007, where Russia raised the idea of trying to multilateralize the treaty, bringing other countries into it. The United States government was supportive of that idea, but there were no takers. China did not want to join, other countries did not want to join, and it's not clear to me that the Russians pushed this issue particularly hard. Now, on one hand, I understand the Russian concern because most third countries that have intermediate-range missiles are much closer geographically to Russia than they are to the United States. But when you look at the full panoply of Russian military forces, including the fact that Russia has 15 times as many nuclear weapons as any other country in the world except for the United States, I would argue Russia did not need intermediate-range missiles. But even if they were concerned about this, the Russians had an honest path forward, which would have been to withdraw from the treaty. The INF Treaty has a withdrawal provision. You give 6 months' notice. This is what President Trump did or announced on Saturday that the United States will do. Russia could have done it, and if Russia was really concerned that the INF Treaty kept them at a disadvantage, they should have executed that step as opposed to simply deploying missiles in violation of the agreement.
Ambassador, there's been some suggestion that part of the reason for withdrawing from this treaty is China, that China isn't a part of it, and they've been quietly building up their land-based intermediate-range missiles over the last few years. How much of a threat is China?
Well, it's true. I mean, China has built hundreds of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, most of which are conventionally armed. And China can do that because China is outside the treaty. Now, that has been an issue that the U.S. military has looked at increasingly over the last 4 or 5 years, although to date, the U.S. military view has been that we can counter those Chinese systems by using American air and sea-based assets. Some have suggested that having the INF Treaty go away would be good because then the United States could counter the Chinese by deploying land-based intermediate-range missiles in Asia. I personally am skeptical of that because that would require that some American ally, Japan, South Korea, Australia, would be prepared to host these missiles. And in the past, I haven't seen signs that governments in Asia are eager to have on their territory American missiles that could strike either China or Russia. So I'm not sure that having the INF Treaty go away means that we're going to have a ready military solution to address the Chinese issue with.
In the 1980s, one of the big factors driving the INF Treaty was the threat of the US Strategic Defence Initiative, or Star Wars. Are we seeing a new version of that with President Trump's Space Force, and how will that impact arms control over the next few years?
Well, we've already seen the impact of Russian concerns about American missile defenses. Is back in 2011, after the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty entered into force, the Obama administration wanted to go further. They wanted to do further reductions of strategic forces, but also bring in non-strategic nuclear weapons, and maybe for the first time ever, actually have a negotiation that would cover all American and all Russian nuclear weapons. And the Russians never engaged in that process. One of the concerns the Russians raised was about American missile defenses. Now, I personally think that the Russian concern about American missile defense at this point in time is overstated. But the Russians may worry that in the future, American technology may come in with some new ideas and some new systems, and the Russians are nervous that American missile defenses at some point might be able to negate a good portion of their strategic offensive forces, which could upset deterrence. Again, I think the Russian concern on that is overstated, but it's something that Washington's going to have to deal with.
Finally, Ambassador, what do you think is the major security issue that the administration should be focusing on right now?
Well, I do agree with the administration that today we do face, unfortunately, a return of peer competition. We have to look at Russia and China in a way that we didn't have to, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So, that does require that we pay attention to American and our allies' military forces. But at the same time, I would argue that smart arms control can also be a tool that very much advances U.S. security interests. It can promote greater stability, it can reduce the odds of miscalculation by one side or the other, and it can save both sides a lot of money. And unfortunately, at this point in time, when you look at the Trump administration, or specifically at the president and his national security advisor, I'm not sure that they are thinking in terms of how those arms control tools could be useful to the United States.
Stephen Pifer, thanks for joining us today.
Delighted to join you.
The director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, set off on a secret trip to Turkey this week, all in the wake of the killing earlier in the month of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. There, the Washington Post reports, Director Haspel listened to the audio purportedly capturing the interrogation and killing of Khashoggi, and used by Turkey to accuse the Saudis of a premeditated murder. President Trump offered this critique.
They had a very bad original concept. It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups.
And then asked in an interview with the Wall Street Journal whether he thought Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was involved in the killing, the president said he's running things so if anyone were going to be in, it would be him. but he said that was just his feeling. Ultimately, the president says it will be up to Congress to decide what further sanctions should be imposed on the Saudis after revoking the visas of those believed to have been in that hit squad, Chaz.
Yeah, and it's an indication of just how unconvincing the Saudi cover story for Khashoggi's death was, that even Trump was saying, no way, I can't say that with a straight face, because Trump really seemed to want to let this one slide. Firstly, remember the initial reason that Khashoggi was banned in Saudi Arabia was for criticising Trump. Also, Trump really doesn't want to risk that $110 billion arms deal he keeps talking about. You know, the one that actually only features about $14.5 billion of confirmed sales. But these were special sales because these sales led to a magical, ever-growing total of new jobs.
We're talking about over 40,000 jobs in the United States.
It's 450,000 jobs. It's 500,000 jobs, 600,000 jobs, maybe more than that. You're talking about over 1 million jobs.
It's like a mushroom cloud of jobs. Bear in mind, though, that in the entire American defence sector, weapon sales only support 355,000 jobs. So tripling those jobs for the Saudis sounds inefficient. But in the end, the cover story was just obviously too unconvincing. Maybe Trump should have paid more attention the last time that Saudi Arabia carried out one of their famous investigations, like when they blew up a school bus in Yemen a few months back. Back then, they also very credibly denied that the vehicle they targeted was a school bus full of children, and they said it was a legitimate target, which would have come as news to some of the children's parents who could only identify their son by his teeth. This parent here said that other parents were arguing over body parts, so they had something to bury. Oh, by the way, after that investigation in September, out of the 154 air raids that took place in Yemen that month where their targets could be identified, over 70% of the targets were non-military sites. So don't forget that when we're talking about this one single brutally murdered journalist.
The Saudis, of course, claimed earlier in the week that Khashoggi was accidentally strangled during a fistfight which erupted during his questioning by rogue officials who'd embarked on an unauthorised extradition effort. Well, that explanation pretty quickly fell apart. It was disputed by the Turkish President Erdogan, who still has those audio tapes. So now the Saudi story has shifted again. The official Saudi press agency saying, according to prosecutors who have interrogated suspects in the killing, the suspect in the incident had committed their act with a premeditated intention. But I guess, Chaz, we kind of knew that already because they had brought an autopsy expert with them, a bone saw, and let's not forget that fake beard that came from Riyadh as well. Certain amount of premeditation there.
Good to be prepared, John.
And that is it for another week, but do not forget our special midterm election live show coming up at Sydney's Giant Dwarf Theatre. Lunchtime on Thursday, November the 8th, and yes, there will be hot dogs. We will have some special guests and a special Q&A segment for you as well. There are all the details. Grab your tickets while there are still some left.
Always about the hot dogs. And we will have more for you this week on our Under the Radar Facebook Extra. And let's hope our Extra goes a little bit more smoothly than Ted Cruz's Extra did.
Bye-bye.
Hopefully we can get that resolved, but it at least looks like we're sideways. So I apologize for that. If all of you are shifting at your computers. Okay, don't put your hand over the camera. All right. There you go. No, you went sideways. All right. It's sideways when you're holding it horizontally. Okay, hold it vertically and leave it there.
It tells you it won't let you.
Just hold it vertical and ignore what it tells you. Somebody, BB, call Josh and figure out if we're doing this right. I apologize for winging this. We're sitting here with an iPhone trying to figure this out, and Emily, you're now broadcasting yourself.